Hello and welcome to part 2 for Business Ethics, Chapter 10. In the first part, we looked at the benefits, detriments, and ethical issues of remote work and corporate campuses. In this section, we are going to look at the benefits, detriments, and ethical issues that arise from providing alternatives to traditional patterns of work and from automation, robots, and AI in the workplace. So first, when we think about alternatives to traditional patterns of work, we have to think about what a traditional pattern of work is, and we're mostly familiar with it. It's the 9 to 5 or the 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, where employees are expected to be in office for those full 40 plus hours every single week, ready to be productive and engaged the entire time. But this doesn't work for everybody. There are many people with weekday commitments, like if they're caring for a family member, or they have children, or if they have a disability, which makes it a bit more difficult to be on site for a full 40 plus hour work week, or they don't want to. They have other goals. They want to go back to school or run their own business on the side or volunteer or pursue their artistic goals. So since the early 2000s, there has been an increase in alternative patterns of work that are offered by many workplaces. One of them is job sharing, wherein there's one full-time job, but it's split into 2 employees. It's different to part-time work because it's explicitly stated in the job description that the 2 people will work as a team to get the roles of the job completed. So sometimes this can be someone will work in the morning and then the other person on the team will work in the afternoon. Sometimes it will be that someone works Monday through Wednesday and the other person works Thursday, Friday. And when these kinds of partnerships are successful, there's a lot of open communication. People say what they did and what they expect the other person is going to be faced with, and vice versa. They have 2 different diverse viewpoints on how to solve problems, which can often lead to solutions that are creative and efficient, that whereas one mind might not have been able to come up with it without that. And sometimes people who want to be job sharers apply as a team to a company and propose that they make this a job sharing situation. What about the benefits to the employer? Well, maybe a more suspicious one is, of course, that if you go below a certain number of hours, you no longer have to offer benefits like health insurance, which can save costs, especially if that is the choice of the worker themselves. They're willing to sacrifice that for having more free time, less stress, and turns out oftentimes an increased ability to produce higher quality work because of the less stress, the less time pressure. So that's good for everybody. That's good for the employer and the employee. There are some downsides. Of course, not all jobs are conducive to job sharing. Something like, let's see what they have here. Well, they don't actually have lists, but I would imagine something like a doctor. You can't necessarily, well, maybe not. I'm not sure that that's a great example. So I'll just put that on some back burner for a second. But another negative thing that can happen for employers is that there can be extra time needed because the partners who are sharing the job have to do a whole lot of communication that wouldn't necessarily otherwise be needed. Sometimes people are confused as to what role they're supposed to be fulfilling or what part of the role. And that kind of fixing miscommunication can take up a whole lot of time. They say especially if neither one of the partners is formally in charge. So there could be some productivity loss as well. Our book tells us that the ethical question raised by job sharing boils down to whether the employee is hiring job sharers to improve productivity and meet employee preferences, or hiring part-time workers to improve profitability at the employee's expense. So this keeps coming up again and again and again. If you want to be an ethical business person, you need to respect and take into account the needs of your employees, not try to cut costs at every moment, no matter how it affects the workforce at all. They do say some roles that work well with job sharing, like data entry, because they are things that require a lot less supervision from a management team. Another business model that is an alternative to traditional patterns of work is flex time. So now these are full-time employees that all have the same hours, but you can shift it around. Not necessarily, actually. Some of them, if you have demonstrated that you're able to get the same amount of work done in a shorter period of time, some workplaces say, okay, you can only come in 8 hours a day for 4 days of the week. But I think by far the more common pattern of flex time is you would work 4 10-hour days, or you come in a couple hours later because you want to get your kids off to school, or you choose to work on a Sunday and actually take off the Friday instead. All these things are considered flex time. And of course, more diverse workforce can be employed this way. Mothers and older people and segments of the population that just could not fit their lives into 9 to 5, 5 days a week. So we looked at some of the benefits of diversity in a previous chapter. I don't necessarily want to rehash that now. You could take a look back at that video. But some of the detriments can be that some states actually mandate what work hours are. And if those get changed around, employees might be legally allowed to claim for overtime, or even in the least bad scenario, you're still sort of breaking state regulations. Even if you're not working overtime, you're just letting your employees set differing hours. Another detriment is that same sort of unconscious bias in which people who start work later, even people who are just as or more productive than their early rising counterparts, are seen as lazy or not as dedicated to their job as people who come in for traditional hours. So here with the job sharing plan, you can think of some questions. How would it benefit company, employees? What are the negative effects it might have? And then, is there a potential for discrimination when you decide who gets to have what kind of job shares? And in this particular situation that they set up, where you're a department head in a mid-sized clothing manufacturer, you'd have to weigh the pros and cons. But again, we're going to leave that to a potential homework question. And now this skips straight to the gig economy before talking about another major difference in modern workplace environments, which is the access economy. Some other people call it peer-to-peer or the online platform economy. So in traditional buy-sell markets, of course, in the capitalist economic market, there are buyers and sellers. There are companies, even if they're just individuals, and consumers. But with the advent of online platforms, there have been a rise in company models like Lyft, Uber, Airbnb, and TaskRabbit, in which the company doesn't really have much to do with providing the service or using the service. They provide the platform for their customers to do both. So you have a platform that you have access to, and somebody can offer their apartment on Airbnb and another consumer can rent it. And this is not brand new, but it is certainly brand new that it is so pervasive. And it brings up new ethical issues, as you might imagine. One positive thing is that small businesses can get a foot in the door. Traditional companies with IPOs and stocks and needs for capital that exceed tens of millions of dollars make a high barrier to entry for someone who wants to start a new business. It's very difficult to raise that kind of capital, that kind of money, without the approval of investment banks. So when people think about access economy platforms, they argue that there's a democratization of capital in which more people can start smaller businesses and not have to compete with these mega firms or convince investment banks to invest in them. But one issue is regulation, and you may have seen this online in recent months or years, in which there may not be the same kind of safety protocols for people taking an Uber or a Lyft or staying in an Airbnb. There wide variety of how you get treated as both someone who is the provider of a good or service and who is the user of that good or service. Sometimes you might see the horror stories online of signing up for an Airbnb and having extraordinarily high cleaning fees, and you have to follow 15 rules, and then the hot water doesn't even work. And that is all part of regulation. The hospitality industry, hotels, motels, are highly regulated. There is going to be a regular experience that you are going to have at them. They have to have fire exits marked. They have to have hot water and heat if it's a certain degree cold. Whereas on an access economy, this isn't the case, at least so far. There's another case from the real world, the Oasis collections, which is an interesting one, and I would encourage you to do that one for your homework. The homework this week is going to be to pick several of these cases and write about them. But then we will finally, in this section, think about the gig economy. Excuse me. We've talked about it in the past, and we add on here about some of the real serious ethical issues that face both employers and employees as the gig economy grows. Now, we are probably all familiar with the terms contractor and freelance employees, but contractors and freelance employees tend to have stipulations of work hours and compensation in the contracts that they sign with companies, whereas gig employees generally do not. Some people want the gig economy for the flexibility and the freedom. They can work as much or as little as they want to. They can shuffle their schedule around however they can. They are in charge of what their day looks like, but they have little to no benefits. They have to pay for their own health insurance. They have to pay their own payroll tax, FICA. So that's huge, 15%, I think, of whatever money that you bring in. And it's highly unstable. You don't know from day to day how much work you're necessarily going to get, if that work is safe, if something happens, you're going to be able to handle it financially. And this can be a really huge savings for employers on the back of the fact that it creates a workforce with little to no security, which many people think is unjust, unethical, and unfair. Oh, I guess they did talk about it a little bit. This is the access economy model, where in the purple on the right-hand side is the platform, like the actual interface that you would go to on Airbnb or TaskRabbit, in which the consumers form both the labor and the capital. They feed into it and use the platform. Here we get, again, the list here of employment relationships that exist between employers and employees, either being hired normally on the traditional model or as contractors, freelancers, and gig workers. The last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter, robotics, artificial intelligence, and the workplace of the future. So, okay, again, this came out in 2018, and there have been giant leaps in technology since then. We all know about the large language models and how they are beginning to influence how life works on the internet and beyond. I know a lot of you are familiar with it because I can see it in your homework. But what does this mean for the larger workforce in the future? A McKinsey Global Institute study predicts that by 2030, 800 million jobs may be automated. What are we going to do with all of those people? Is that globally? Yeah, that's globally. 20% of the global workforce. So in wealthy industrialized nations where we might feel the effects more because companies will save more by eliminating those higher paid employees. So what do we do with all those people? Again, that's the biggest and most immediate ethical question. Some of them are going to be able to transition to other jobs immediately. They'll have the skill sets and the flexibility to do so. But that's only going to be, something like 25%. Let's see what they say. I don't see a percentage here, but they do say that there'll still be between 20 and 50 million people that are not going to be easily able to get other jobs. They are older, or they don't have the correct skills and don't have the abilities to get them. Retraining might be a path, but for other people, it will not be. Geographically, immobile workers and older workers again. So we might have millions and millions of people that are enduring job loss for a very long time, affecting both them and the wider economy. We learn that oftentimes jobs that are available for less educated people in lower socioeconomic income brackets will be disproportionately affected, meaning machine operators, factory workers, and food workers. And here you might automatically see an ethical issue, meaning there are going to be a lot of people that are poor that are going to be even poorer and have fewer opportunities to get a job that takes care of themselves and their families, further increasing economic inequality in the United States and the rest of the world. So what do you do if you want to be an ethical company when it comes to automation and AI? You have to think about how you're going to reflect your company's core ethical values in cybersecurity, protecting data, protecting your data and your employees' data, how you're going to retrain and empower your workers when you automate some subset of your jobs, and how quickly you should implement the automation process. The very last thing here is thinking about artificial intelligence. And we only get a couple of bits of data from our book. And again, we'll think about case studies with large language models when we do our last 3 weeks. So I think that's going to wrap up part 2 for chapter 10. As always, email with questions, comments, or concerns, and I will see you next week.